America is and has been at a turning point not just since a certain event in 2020, but for decades. Being a superpower with billions to spare to help its citizens, for some reason, America seems to just stand by and even at times lose money when investing in its citizens could benefit it more than just by profit margins. From homelessness to rehabilitation programs or even using tax dollar money to keep cities up to standard, America refuses to do so. But today we're only going to focus on one problem that affects America's citizens and a piece of media that I consider historical and how over time it lost its original purpose. Comic books and what they represent along with illiteracy and how it's affecting stories we love. We'll start with comics' first golden boy, Superman. Created by a duo of friends, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, born in Cleveland, Ohio to poor immigrant parents, created Superman first as a villain inspired by a folk tale of John Henry, which didn't last long. In 1938, the pair then created the hero we know and love today, Superman. Though never said aloud, Joanne Siegel, Jerry Siegel's wife, and the model who served as the visual inspiration for the original Lois Lane, always believed that the death of Jerry's father was the largest factor contributing to the creation of Superman. Siegel's father died of a heart attack during a robbery of a clothing store, and there are reports of early sketches of Superman saving a man who looked like his father. The appearance of Superman being inspired by Siegel himself further backs this claim. Siegel even made Superman a reporter because it was his childhood dream. The creation of Superman's heroism stemmed from real-world issues. One of the main reasons for early success of the character was because of this. Created and inspired by a real-life personal tragedy of a man who evidently just wanted to save his father, Superman grew as a beloved character because of the comfort he brought to people in a time where it was most needed in the world. At first using real-life events from their home state as inspiration for stories, the pair gradually moved on to using bigger events as time passed, writing stories about Superman taking down anti-Semitic people. The pair, being Jewish themselves, wanted to write more about a hero who defends the much weaker and mistreated. Comics have and always will be a reflection of our real world, despite being fiction. Writers have taken it upon themselves to use real-life events to make stories that bring hope and unity to readers during trying historical times and even making a real difference. One of their most popular stories is one where Superman confronts Hitler and exposes the horrors that he is unleashing on innocent people, bringing awareness to the general public of what Hitler was doing while bringing hope and unity to audiences in a time of fear. This story managed to gain the attention of the German SS newspaper, who said the two were brainwashing the children of America and trying to push their Jewish agenda, even going as far as saying, quote, "There is nothing the sadists won't do for money." But these stories did inspire other Jewish artists to create their own comics about protecting the persecuted. Jack and Joe Kirby, some of the artists who were inspired and then went on to create Captain America, and we all know how he feels about Nazis. Superman represents hope, unity, heroism, and humanity at its core. In stories with Superman, you knew everything is going to be okay because he was there and inspired you to be good like him. Before James Gunn's iteration of the character, we had nothing but polar opposites of what Superman is and represents. Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, Injustice, and even other studios taking on the evil Superman trope. All of these approach Superman's character in such a way that totally disrespects who he is. While Injustice is its own storyline, it taints people's image of Superman, and some even prefer this version of the character. Same with the Snyder version. While there's nothing wrong with preferring a certain storyline, most who do prefer these don't understand Superman as a character and are blinded by the more edgy take. For a while, there was an obsession with making comic book movies darker in tone, an obsession that obviously didn't work with general audiences. So this stems the question, why were the very studios who created Superman so against showing him as what he represented? Though again not fan favorites by general audiences, these products brought in a lot of money. With all this being said, you might be asking, what does this have to do with anything about the decline in literacy or the rise of capitalism? Since the release of the first Superman issue on April 18, 1938, literacy has been at a decline. In 1940, the illiteracy percentage was at a very low 2.9% in Americans 14 years and older. As of 2023, 54% of people cannot read above a 6th grade level. That's more than 130 million people, which is more than the amount of people that watched last year's Super Bowl, 127 million. Again, you might be asking, what does this have to do with comic books? Since the very creation of Superman, capitalist greed has affected comic books and their creators. The original plan for Superman comics was for him to be in newspaper comic strips, but MC Gaines pushed for the comics to be published in a magazine live format, which we still see them in till this day. This was to pay the creators less because it was a newer format. The two being eventually swayed to sell the rights to their character that they felt so passionate about for $130, which today only equates to $2,999.73, before even becoming a household name. It wasn't until how popular Superman became when the pair realized they were swayed to sell the rights to him. Siegel was told that the pair were easily replaceable, so an offer was given to them. Keep working on these comics but not make any money, or let someone else take over. Because of their passion and love for the character, they chose to stick with it. While I don't have much data to back up this claim, I believe that illiteracy is affecting how people perceive comic book media or characters, and it causes writers to dumb down characters to make them more appealing to the general audience, and characters who don't fall victim to what is known as the dumbed down effect are criticized. The dumbed down effect is where the media is oversimplifying broader, much more complex themes to appeal to more general audiences at the expense of intellectualism. The term stemmed from 1933 when motion picture screenplay writers changed the way they wrote in order to gain appeal with those who had little education or intelligence. This will usually simplify critical thinking points to the point where it undermines intellectual standard in society, then trivializes not just artistic standard, but cultural and academic standards. This not only stems in our media, but everyday ways of life. This subject could be a video in itself, so I'll just finish off by saying Brave New World by Aldous Huxley explains it better than I can at this moment. But at this point in time, we're still only talking about superheroes. So I'll give a more recent example, the MCU's John Walker. First introduced in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, John served as the universe's dark reflection of the beloved Steve Rogers. If you know anything about John or the show, then you might know what moment I'm going to bring up, but we'll get to that soon. First, I would like to talk about what John Walker originally was, then what eventually become in the MCU.
Time to go to work.
First introduced as a more golden boy who does good, knows good kind of character, who at first wanted to be a Steve Rogers successor, but had certain characteristic traits that held him back from this. A man who acts as he's always right, very authority-based, and more in tune with politics and governmental matters, rather than a moral obligation to do what's right. Pre-Serum John is a spunky and very tenacious man who wants to do things by the book and be a part of something bigger than himself, but can hold more ego and stubbornness as compared to compassion and steadfastness. One of my favorite moments in the show is when Lamar and John have a conversation about the super soldier serum.
Power just makes a person more of themselves, right? Carly Morgenthau, Steve Rogers.
But as the pressures of being Captain America keep stacking on top of John, that back-of-mind thought seems to become an obsession as the show goes on, ultimately making him take the serum. Furthermore, when Lamar is killed, the idea of what John Walker was ultimately dies with Lamar, and John ultimately becomes who he actually is. Because as we know, the serum enhances what's already inside of a person. This scene is so misunderstood in the grand scheme of what both Walker represents and what Steve is supposed to represent. Steve doesn't represent what America is, he represents what it should be. A much more compassionate and helping other people state that hopes who they can inspires others to do the same despite what the law says. While John Walker more represents a modern America, a very authority-based man who believes in following orders and holding down the law even if not being the right thing to do, and can get away with it as long as it's in the name of militarization. Now that we see the clear differences between the two characters, this begs the question. Why are people comparing and contrasting the characters of Steve Rogers and John Walker as two sides of the same coin? While yes, both had killed, both soldiers of war, and most importantly, victims of a system who had taken advantage of them, whether killing another person is right or wrong is a subject for debate. It's not what we'll be focusing on. Steve Rogers clearly states,
I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from.
And simply does what he does not because he wants to, but because he believes he has to. Again, while the morality of killing is up for debate, stopping bad guys from bombing New York and executing a surrendering bad guy in front of civilians is a very different scenario. The pure anger and authority that John's face holds is the complete opposite of what we would see on Steve. While Steve has had scenes of facially expressed anger and frustration, as an audience we understood that Steve held these faces out of frustration because he had to distrust a friend and literally fight his best friend who was trying to kill him. On the other hand, John seems to be an angry, bloodlusted, broken man who just wants to kill. Steve, at his core, while yes good, is extremely selfish.
Captain America, God's righteous man, pretending you could live without a war.
While yes, Steve fights for the right thing, just always has to fight a war. But this is because
I see a situation pointed south. I can't ignore it. Sometimes I wish I could. No, you don't.
While John can't look away because he's ordered not to or is obsessed with fulfilling the mission. The difference between Steve and John is that despite killing people and being soldiers, Steve killed when he had to and always looked out for others despite what orders of the law said so, which is literally the plot of all the Captain America movies. Even willing to die and go against the ones closest to him in the name of what's right. John, despite the greater good, followed orders and only understood how to be a soldier rather than a person who could help. The complete opposite of what Steve represented, which is why he ultimately became a gun for hire rather than a vigilante. A good man versus a good soldier.
Time to go to work.
Though John did ultimately redeem himself at the end of The Falcon and Winter Soldier, the damage to his reputation was done because of what he believed he had to do because he knew nothing other than following orders. This is backed by this year's Thunderbolts when we see John obsessing over his public image as a soldier rather than being his wife and child's husband and father, causing them to leave him. It wasn't even until years later when people came around to John. If you were around during The Falcon and the Winter Soldier at release, you might remember the backlash that Wyatt Russell received from fans simply for being a great actor, going as far as threats being made against his life. John Walker and Wyatt Russell seemed to be more hated than the actual villain of the show, Zemo. While a fantastic villain and an all-around fantastic show, we're still only talking about John. It wasn't again until this year's Thunderbolts when people came around to John. Which brings me to the original point, the dumbing down effect. John Walker at the latter half of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier was a broken man taken down by the very system that created him and mandated his actions. Fast forward to today, while John, yes, still holds some semblance of his original complexity, it is very obvious that they got rid of his serious authoritarian personality and replaced it with a much more comedic and dumber version than the one previously shown. While I'm not saying John is a complete 180, it is apparent that there is a change in character that makes him less serious, and it's obvious that general audiences are much more captivated by a character that has less serious tones and much more comedic ones to them. While comedy is a big part of comics, it is obvious that the movies are meant to appeal to more younger audiences. If anyone is a comic reader, then they know not just John, but many more characters have been victim of this. Wong, the Hulk, Ant-Man, the Mandarin, and so much more just in the MCU. Most audiences haven't even really seen truly what these characters are and what they represent. Characters have lost identity because of writers being forced to write characters how studios want them rather than how they actually are. Which segues into a point that ties this all together. The corporate greed that ruins characters for what we as comic fans know them as. The past few years, the MCU has seen flop after flop, which are obviously just money grabs that are funding the next big bad saga. While I would love to talk about the downhill that the MCU has been on with this Doom era and how the studio obviously didn't know what it was doing for a couple years, that's for another day. The continuation of the lack of creative freedom that Marvel Studios gives its directors is starting to become an evident problem, not just with cast and crew, but audiences. For example, did you know that the first Ant-Man film was supposed to be directed by Edgar Wright? Teased at San Diego Comic-Con in 2006 alongside Jon Favreau's Iron Man, Captain America, and The Incredible Hulk, Wright's involvement in Ant-Man goes as far back as 2003 when Edgar wrote a narrative blueprint for Artisan Entertainment, who, at the time, held the rights for the character, saying, quote, "The idea that we have for the adaptation is to actually involve both. It's to have a film that is basically about Henry Pym and Scott Lang. So you actually do a prologue where you see Pym as Ant-Man in action in the 60s in sort of Tales to Astonish mode, basically. And then the contemporary sort of flash forward is Scott Lang's story and how he comes to acquire the suit, how he crosses paths with Henry Pym, and then in an interesting sort of Machiavellian way, teams up with him. So it's like an interesting thing, like the Marvel premiere one that I read, which is Scott Lang's origin. It's very brief like a lot of those origin comics are, and in a way, the details that are skipped through in the panels and the kind of thing that we'd spend half an hour on. But then trouble with the studio and Wright formed. Through early 2014, the studio had a different vision for what they wanted the film to be. Conflicts arose because the studio wanted a family-friendly oriented film that immediately tied into the MCU, which is the version we ended up getting, while Wright wanted a standalone film that could eventually be tied into other MCU projects. Wright wrote 2 additional drafts of a script for the film to be more to Marvel's liking, but something that he would still want to make. Still, this wasn't to the studio's liking, and they decided to do a complete rewrite of the script with the in-house writers, without any input from Edgar Wright. It was when the final script came out that Edgar felt it lacked his voice, and was unfamiliar with his vision. Roughly 2 months before filming began for Ant-Man, Wright decided to leave the project and even stated years later, "I wanted to make a Marvel movie, but I don't think they really wanted to make an Edgar Wright movie. I was the writer-director on it, and then they wanted to do a draft without me. And having written all my other movies, that's a tough thing to move forward. Thinking if I do one of these movies, I would like to be the writer-director. Suddenly becoming a director for hire on it, you're sort of less emotionally invested and you start to wonder why you're there really. While the film was a success and Paul Rudd's take on the character immediately became a fan favorite, this film is a great example of the dumbed down effect just because of how forgettable it is. Not just the first film, but all three. Ant-Man as a standalone character in the MCU has very little and to be honest no depth. Paul Rudd isn't given much range to work with at all, and while does great with what he can, there's no emotional depth, just comedy with a mix of dullness. The most emotional scene isn't even in his own movie. It's in Avengers Endgame when Scott sees his daughter Cassie 5 years older than the last time we saw her, and this scene was barely 10 seconds long. While yes, there have been misses, there have also been hits. Though I did use it as a negative example previously, this year's Thunderbolts is brilliant. An amazing take on mental health, specifically on the ones of trafficked orphans, soldiers, drug addicts, and those with bipolar disorders. While yes, the film does have the dumbing down effect, one thing it does way better than the most MCU films is it takes itself seriously when it has to. The third act of Thunderbolts is one of the most intense, heroic, and emotionally vulnerable pieces that we've seen in the MCU, probably ever as of far.
I'm here. You're not alone.
Sadly, the film is considered an MCU flop, and if not front-page characters of the universe, we likely would have moved on from these characters as amazing as they were, as seen by the treatment the Eternals were given, despite being a fundamentally great comic book film. Not only the Eternals, but a lot of fan favorites by comic fans. Kamala Khan, Moon Knight, the Marvels in general, Shang-Chi, and again, so much more just in the MCU. So this begs the question you might have asked at the beginning. What does this have to do with capitalism and illiteracy? Since the creation of Superman, illiteracy has gone up more than 50%, and in that time, comic book media corporations have seen profit margins increase by billions. Specifically, $17.69 billion as of 2025. As we know with corporations, once they find a formula that works, and especially one that makes them a lot of money, they tend to stick with it, and it's very hard to get an idea across, especially when success has been made, ruining any potential creativity that can be given to characters, completely tainting them or just straight up ignoring them despite being iconic characters or stories, as seen with the Edgar Wright situation. So if audiences can't critically think or understand complex themes, why include them when you can just make a character a comedic hunk that's the opposite of their comic counterpart, since most audiences don't actually read or care for comics, especially if they're not front-page characters of the universe. Furthermore, most of the live-action audiences aren't very competent or have very much knowledge of comic book media outside of large live-action adaptations. A good majority of the audience don't know that Hank Pym is actually much more important to the Avengers than Scott Lang is. For those who don't know, Hank is actually the founder of the Avengers, along with his wife, Janet Van Dyne, the original Wasp. Despite being founding members that create interesting stories in the comics and could create much more interesting films in the MCU, they're completely ignored and or not seen until later films. So instead of keeping true to the comics and having a multitude of stories possible with Hank, they just hold him to being a very forgotten character we might not see again. There are many missed opportunity examples within the MCU. More exploration of the Red Room and Natasha's rivalry with Elena, the Natasha and Bucky romance, Hawkeye as a whole, and again, many more just in the MCU. Despite this, there are obvious positives that are happening on the other side of the comic world. DC, since the hiring of James Gunn with the Suicide Squad and Matt Reeves' The Batman, has been on a very positive progression since whatever the 2010s was.
Save Martha! Why did you say that?
While Gunn has since the Guardians films very much changed characters from what they originally were in the comics, these have been for the better, making lesser-known characters somewhat of household names, and to me, Drax is sadly the only counterpart to this and is very much a victim to the dumbing down effect. There is very much a sort of enjoyment from audiences watching Gunn's projects since Guardians 1 and his inheritance of the DCU as evident by the continued success of his films and TV shows. While yes, Gunn does at times dumb down projects, not that this is a complete negative, but some projects do have quite a bit of expedition that can be obvious after the first watch, but totally nowhere close to this.
This is Katana. She's got my back. She can cut all you in half with one sword stroke, just like mowing the lawn. I would advise not getting killed by her. Her sword traps the souls of its victims.
Furthermore, Reeves' grounded and much darker take on the world of Gotham has very much been a success with audiences, with a hit show and a new movie seeming to be confirmed, while at times has moments that contradict Batman for what he's known for.
La, right there. What is this, Riddler, stupid or something? Jesus, look at you two. World's greatest detectives. Am I the only one here knows the difference between L and law?
Unrealistic moments, and a not-so-comic accurate Riddler, it's still a really good movie and adaptation, so who cares? With this being said, how can we fix this? Continue to protest for what we want. As evident with the DC protest that gave the audiences what they wanted, and continuing to not support films that are obviously not a respect piece to love characters. Also, backed up by the continued backlash and lack of support for certain films that cause studios to restart universes and storylines as a whole. Also, reading or watching the media and really thinking about what it could be conveying. As silly as it sounds, being actively engaged with what's going on and thinking about what it can represent brings a new level of understanding for yourself. Most are usually passive learners when it comes to analyzing media. People who hear or see things but don't really analyze it to deeper detail and leave it to surface level understanding rather than going in depth to what a character could be referencing. Not just in the fictional world, but ours. On the other hand, active learning can improve your foundation in language, improve accuracy of words, and fully grasp the nuances of what you could be reading or hearing because you're deliberately analyzing every word and phrase, which could help you understand what is being talked about on screen or on paper. This not only goes for just watching a superhero movie, but any aspect of life that requires critical thinking. Comic books and movies are mirror images of what our world represents. These stories, while yes fictional, have a sense of personal mixtures into them. Superman is an immigrant created by children of immigrants. Both have deceased fathers and have a passion for storytelling. See what I mean? While yes fictional, the personal themes from the creators attached to the characters create a sense of humility to them, because they're just like you and me. While I can't say I've been bitten by a radioactive spider or can swing from buildings, I can say that I relate to Peter Parker having personal problems. Again, while not a direct relation to exactly what he's been through, I have had times where giving up seemed to be the best choice. But to keep going, to make the hard choices, to get through it and come out stronger because of it is what makes us human. Comic books have lost the identity of being a reflection piece of society that shows us it's okay to be vulnerable, emotional beings that are stronger together. A point that I saw be made against this year's Superman was that he wasn't manly because he cried, saved animals, and was constantly in a defensive state despite being borderline invincible. To that I say, when did it become a bad thing to be one who cries, who saves animals from being hurt, who does the right thing? As consumers, we have to remember that while comic runs lately have not been the greatest focal pieces for characters we love, they still serve as the original stepping stones for what they represent. To that I say, we should be ashamed that we allowed corporations to take over very vulnerable personal stories from creators and artists who have not been given proper credit and turn them into studio slop. Even going as far as having anti-human characters who obviously represent a propaganda piece that no Captain America would ever work with, yet the writers and directors made him. To finish off this passion project, I'd like to say, be the good these characters represent. Help yourself, but most importantly, help others. You can't call yourself a superhero fan if you look the other way when someone needs help. Be the good in the world, and don't let a studio wipe out your representation. Fight for what you believe is right. Whether people admit it, representation is important, and Marvel has a history of whitewashing, tainting, or just straight up erasing characters. It's important to have passion, but it's more important to do the right thing, to be you, and to recognize others. Don't let them dumb down what makes you, you. Your trauma, gender, sexuality, race, religion, your existence.